everyone turning out, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the International Studies Department, the Department of Geography as well. I'm Sandra Gorman. I teach in both IS and political science, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jon Unruh, who's a professor of geography at McGill University. His research is applied, and his policy work over the past 25 years has focused on war affected human geographies with a particular focus on the re-establishment of land and property rights after armed conflict. His past work has dealt with Islamic, customary, statutory, and war-related approaches to land rights, and how these interact with displaced populations, ethnic cleansing, restitution, legal pluralism, and agriculture in post-war and peacebuilding scenarios. So his work really bridges both the academic and policy worlds. He has advised a variety of governments as well as bilateral and multilateral organizations, including the UN, the World Bank, USAID, and others. He also has published over 50 academic articles and conducted field work in a long list of countries, including Sudan, Yemen, Liberia, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, East Timor, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia. He's also the co-editor of a forthcoming 6-volume set on post-conflict peacebuilding and natural resource management, which will be coming out in March with Routledge. I personally first became familiar with Dr. Unruh's work some time ago and have appreciated the rich contextualization of his policy prescriptions and his understanding of the complexities of local settings after conflict. Specifically, how the collective experience of violence can change communities and authority structures within those communities. He has demonstrated a consistent effort in his work to promote land rights institutions that are effective, legitimate, and equitable. It's a huge privilege for us to have him here at the University of Richmond, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Dr. Gorman. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as an academic label, I have geographer here, and so in addition to memorizing state capitals, we also get on planes and we go to interesting places, and we usually always ask the same sort of question. It's the where question. Where are things happening? So from my angle on the where question is this one of land and property rights. Okay. So here what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how land and property rights serve as one sort of thing that is a motor for this notion of grievances. Okay. So when we have a grievance, it's more than just somebody owes you something and you're angry at him. So what we're talking about here is a group of people that has an accumulation of grievances over time. Okay. So these become narratives of grievance. And so what I'm going to ask here is, how do these work? How do these narratives of grievance develop over time? Okay? And what is their role during an armed conflict? And what is their role before an armed conflict? And is there any opportunity there for peace-building efforts to kind of package these ideas of narrative and stories into tools for peace-building? Okay? So, narrative of grievance. There's stories that specific groups, right, discrete populations, usually below the level of a country, tell themselves. Usually these stories are not really well aligned with actual history. Okay? So we know how this goes. I tell you a secret and you tell you and you tell. When we get all the way over here, it's very, very different. Okay? Well, if that was that battle 200 years ago and then we're talking about it today, it takes on a life of its own. It has a place in a story. And that story is something that positions a group of people, either with another one or against another one, who also has a story, and it likely affects your group. So it's that sort of interaction between narratives that I'm interested in looking at. Okay, so these narratives, when we put them in a war-torn or war-affected context, usually have a couple of features about them. Okay. It involves how and who and where we have been victimized or unjustly treated or discriminated against. So it's a group story about the other group, okay? And so this idea is that when we have this story and we're angry about it, okay, we're angry about the injustice and the discrimination over time, usually generations, that affects our behavior, okay? It affects our decision making against the other group. As we know, we can sort of push that change in behavior far enough, and if we're unhappy enough, then there's a very short distance between that degree of unhappiness and then armed conflict, okay? So, this idea of a narrative, of grievance, a story that a group has that articulates how they've been victimized and how this has happened and by who over time, is this idea of the group sort of notion, right? So it plays a strong sort of role in the development of civil war. So this isn't one state's armies fighting another state's armies. These are groups of people, right, that come to be opposed to each other in a society or between societies. Okay? And this is what I want to look at today. So we've got the narrative, the story, right, that we tell ourselves as a group. I argue that story develops around something that is very, very problematic, right? So I call them central dilemmas, right? So it's the kernel around which the narrative starts to coalesce, it starts to develop, well before an armed conflict. Right? So I'm going to look at this idea of this central dilemma and kind of see how it functions, how it comes online, how it develops, and how it's sort of treated. Okay? So these dilemmas, like the narratives, they fit into a history, right? And ideas of justice and injustice, but also of aspiration, right? What is a group, what do they want? Okay? Do they want something as clear as revenge or retribution or just better schools? Well, what is it that they want? So injustice, victimization is coupled with aspiration, swirls around this central issue, this dilemma, and then it becomes this narrative, okay? So this narrative, if it isn't dealt with, if it isn't somehow rectified over time, it aggravates, as we know, okay? So you become more and more angry as discrimination continues, injustice continues, and as specific events in history get kind of plucked out of history and then put into your narrative, basically to justify the narrative, right? So government did this to my people, and we take that incident and we say, oh, add that to the narrative. See, it's just one more reason that they want us, right? So it's a cherry picking of history, put it into the narrative, and the narrative grows, aggravates, solidifies, okay, over time, okay? So this idea of this central dilemma becoming really aggravated over time. So the dilemma is then shared by the separate groups, okay? So we have a reason that my group and yours don't get along. You may not have that same sort of reason, but you will because I'm angry about it, therefore you're going to have an angle on it. Okay? So we share this dilemma, the different groups. And here's a central issue here. The angle or the understanding of the dilemma, the central issue, has very different interpretations, okay? Think about the Palestinian and Israeli land rights problem, okay? They share that dilemma, land rights, very different angles on it, very different interpretations about history, about cause and effect, about victimization, who did who, to where and to what, okay? So, very much sort of different ideas. So these interpretations become aligned, right, with different sides in society and then different sides in the conflict, right? So in a way, this central dilemma inside this narrative in some ways kind of helps define who's opposed to who, right? Because these different interpretations become aligned with the different sides in the war. And again, connected to these perceptions of justice and injustice, livelihoods, local and national institutions, all sorts of, so basically, livelihood, just how you make it through your day, what you do in your day. If you're discriminated against in your day by that group, that adds to the narrative, that adds to your interpretation of it, okay? So, these central dilemmas, right? So what I've done by sort of poking around the world over perhaps too many years is that I've noticed that in a large number of these central dilemmas around which narratives develop, there's a great deal of ambiguity and confusion and different understandings over what should be some pretty simple stuff. And these are just the terms, the actual words, right? That are used to describe the central dilemma by one party versus another. Okay? So the Janjaweed versus the rebels, right? They're going to talk about one thing. They're going to use the same words, but wow, do they have different meanings about it. Okay? And so this kind of matters because when you throw the international community in on this, especially the blue helmets, the UN guys that want to go in and make peace, they want to unpack what's going on, right? They want to say, okay, well, what is the central problem here? We're gonna make peace. So tell us, and they start to hear the same words, but they have no clue what it means because on the ground there's this massive ambiguity and confusion about what it is we're talking about, right? The nuts and bolts of this central dilemma. Okay. So we're going to talk about this idea, right? We're going to start with these kind of simple notions, just the words themselves, and see how they're linked into this central dilemma and these multiple interpretations that become aligned with different sort of grievance-bearing narratives and then different sides in the actual conflict. So basically, I'm asking, why is this? Why do we observe this phenomenon of confusion and not understanding and very different approaches to just the simple terms? Okay? And if we can figure out why that's there, is there some opportunity there for peace building? So I'm going to take these three cases, right? Colombia, Darfur, and Yemen. And land rights are going to be this central dilemma, okay, around which the opposed groups have constructed a narrative with regard to their opponents, right? So we're going to look at this sort of land rights in this confused and ambiguous scenario that comes on as a narrative develops. So, I'm an academic. We got to do things like what theory is going to explain the world for me. And so you go out and you grab one, and just like any theory that you try to match with what you've observed, it only partially fits. But like a good academic, and like what we do with theories, we get to push theories and chop them in half and throw that half away and take this half and make it bigger and tweak. So I'm going to do that, right? I'm going to tweak this theory that I found called keywords, right? By this guy Raymond Williams back in 1976. He starts this idea of keywords, and it's then grown into this huge project now that's both at Cambridge and at the University of Pittsburgh. Okay, so you got this webpage and just learn all about this theory of keywords, which is not what we're used to thinking about keywords. It's not the index. It's not how to find something. It's not go Google, right? It's not any of those things, but it's a different notion in society. Okay. So here, the idea of keywords is something that is socially prominent, right? The center of a cluster of interlocking terms, and this key word represents contradictory meanings in contemporary society. Okay? The words themselves are actually inseparable from the problems that they seek to describe. We'll talk about why this is. Okay? So this idea of this key word, finding certain words in society that have a strange meaning, because there's multiple meanings, okay? Easy enough when it's, let me grab one here, relativism or property or faith or environment or settlement. But when you take that key word and you put it in a war-affected context, now we've really got a problem, okay? So there's been a number of sort of attempts at peace accords. What the UN really does not like is to bring warring parties together on an expensive trip to Doha or Nairobi or Geneva, only to have them sit down and they're not clueless about what they want to talk about. Okay? And so there's so much disagreement over simple terms that you waste enormous amounts of time. Okay? So today what the UN likes to do is to send people to the field, right, and say, look, talk to the Janjaweed or the rebels or whatever, see if they have a common understanding about this or that. Because when we fly them to wherever and have them sit down, if they can't describe or can't agree with who's sitting across the table on even these terms, then we're in trouble, okay? You hear about this occasionally in the media, right? Well, they're discussing how to talk about maybe getting together, and you think, that'd just be so difficult. In fact, it is, because when you come down to certain words about the problem, vastly different understandings, right? Because these understandings include notions of victimization and who's at fault and this sort of thing. So these keywords are part of the problem, right? So, quick review of this keywords theory, right? So this interaction between meanings. So we have this word, it's got a couple of different meanings, and the meanings then interact, right? In society, when we have this, right, we can call this something like a national debate, okay? Or we can call this something like politics, where we argue back and forth. In a war-torn issue, right, the meanings interact, because the meanings are held by the different sides in the war. So these meanings are actually unresolved, okay? You can't say, you mean this, therefore I'm going to translate that, and this other group this. It's not that. They're just simply unresolved, okay? They're unresolved because it's not easy to resolve this aspect of meanings here, right? Issues, people's histories, grievances, politics, narrative, all kinds of things, right, are caught up in different meanings regarding certain words about our central issue, our central dilemma. So the result is, of course, massive confusion and controversy, and working at cross purposes, and misunderstanding, but it's actually not really misunderstanding, it's just a very different understanding, okay? So contestation, confrontation, public debate, right? So it's debate, of course, Civil War is the debate that we're interested in here. So the evolution, how these words come to have these different meanings, it's a bit like this evolutionary tree, right? It starts off here, the war's up there at the top, things go one way or another, a battle goes here, people are exiled there, discrimination happens, and so the words sort of do that, and they have very, very different meanings, okay? So this idea of polysemy, right, which is sort of included in this keywords theory, is this idea of this development of these keywords. Of course, it happens along with the development of the problem that we're talking about, okay? And so one of the ways that this happens is just kind of like the species do, right? You live over here, I live over here, we use this word differently, we don't interact, and so it becomes different. That's one way. But the way that we're really familiar with it is this way. You take your word and you spin it, right? So politicians are good at this. Warlords are really good at this, right? Instigators, agitators, I can take a discrete population. I know they're angry about this or that. So I'm going to use this word that I know is really going to push their buttons about that other group, and I'm going to pump that word up. I'm really going to use it, right? So you spin it in a negative way. Identity enhancing, victimization, right? You attach your word, your meaning of the word, to a certain group, and they get more agitated, okay? So this feeds into their narrative, of course. The narrative develops. This dilemma, this central dilemma develops as well, right? Now, depending on the beliefs and attitudes of the user, the warlords and politicians and instigators and agitators among us know this, okay? They can actually purposefully make things develop in a certain way. So this idea of variation and confusion, okay? So again, we have this idea of purposely promoting a certain interpretation or a spin as a form of a political or ideological advocacy, or just develops on its own over time, okay? But usually it's a combination of these things. So this graphic here that I just grabbed, so imagine that our keyword develops like this. Here's one term, right? So let's take our one term that's a favorite of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, settlement, okay? These very different things to different groups of people, right? So the Palestinians, the Israelis, maybe subsets of those, the international community, next door neighbors, Palestinian refugees, those in Gaza, those in the West Bank, etc. So we have very different understandings, right? So these key words don't exist just by themselves, but they exist as part of a cluster. Usually you have a keyword, and there's a cluster of secondary words around it, right? So we have this cluster of keywords interpreted very differently by group 1, group 2, group 3, okay? So you can imagine that as this develops over time, this is our society, right? Different sort of groups. Of course, you can have the situation become so aggravated that this group picks up arms against this group. And maybe this group aligns with that group, or maybe this group fights that group, right? So you have sort of very separate kind of networks of interaction. still on this theory, right? So this is all kind of straight from the theory. I'm not changing it yet, right? So the idea here is that social relations regarding this dilemma become more and more aggravated and more divisive, right? These constituencies, the people in here and people in here, start to dislike the people over there more and more, okay? So that these folks stop talking to these folks, right? And so you can imagine how that happens. You just talk to yourself. Well, the more you talk to yourself, the more that keyword takes on a more individualized and important meaning, okay? The keyword will really push the buttons of these people one way, and in these people another way, okay? So you start talking to what's called an isolated network, okay? So information and communication becomes difficult between groups. So our society is still moving toward war, towards civil war. Not there yet, becoming very divisive, right? It's sort of parsed itself off into different groups where these narratives become reinforced, okay? So we start at this point to look back in history to find justification. Again, this cherry picking that goes on in history. A battle won or lost, an event here, an event there. And we start to assemble it into our interpretation, as they do, but differently, okay? In terms of certain issues, and again, this central dilemma. So still on this theory, right? Contested meanings then, right? Of certain terms, very much bound up in the societal problems that they describe, okay? And so what's involved here are things like identity and culture, bound up in your use of the word and in your opponent's use of the word as well, okay? So in this regard, the actual words, the keywords are part of the problem. You really can't take them out of the problem or separate from the problem because they describe it, of course, to different people in different ways, okay? So, back to these words. It's not just a semantic problem. You can't just say, let's just broadcast a better definition of this word. You can't do that because you can't solve the problems by solving or bringing greater clarity into the words or attempting to resolve differences in meaning of the words because the words belong to different streams of history and different streams of narrative development and formation. Okay? So basically, according to the keywords theory, you can look at these keywords to really get a very nuanced understanding about the development of the problem that they describe and why they're so contentious. That's what they're good for. Still on this, according to this the theory. Okay? So, clarifying the confusions and the variations, bringing very sort of clarity and say, this word is going to mean this for everybody in the conflict. You can't do it. The UN likes to try, right? Likes to try to bring clarity. Okay, this peace accord, we're all going to have this word mean this. Not going to happen, right? So then you have this complication where there's this layer of what the UN thinks is going on, and then there's the actual belligerents themselves talking using the same words, but they are thinking something other than that, okay? So peace accords, even preparing for them, can get very difficult. So the problems aren't in the keywords. The problems aren't in the semantics of it, right? Because you can't really solve the keywords problem. The actual issue is in this central dilemma that is going on. The variations in keyword use, right? So this theory sort of proposes 5 criteria, right? For what is a keyword in a society. Here's the first one. It's currently used, and importantly, it's got both a common, a lay meaning or terminology, but also a technical one. Okay? It belongs in academia, it belongs in technology, it belongs in law, but the same term is also of popular usage, right? And there's confusion between what's the technical and what's the common or the lay aspect about it. Okay? So people talk about it during daily discourse, but it also invokes sort of an authority, right? As in terms of a discipline, a technical use, right? So this combination contributes to its complexity, and then of course it's confusion as well. So I just grabbed a short list of these types of words, right, from this keyword project, right? And so it depends on your angle on these words, how you feel about them. That really gets at your different interpretation, right? So the keywords project, in my view, kind of is looking at a very interesting phenomenon, but it's kind of playing it safe because it doesn't look at these words in a really acute sort of format, which is what we're going to do. So it's currently used. It manifests very different meanings, right, when used in different occasions, in a common sort of setting, at the cafe with your friends versus in the classroom, say, okay? Different groups, right? Any one meaning excludes the use of other meanings. So group A, back in my schematic, uses it one way. Everybody in group A knows what it means. Group B, they know what it means too, but it's a different meaning, okay? So, when they're used by groups with different core beliefs or background, and this is what they're attached to. This is why it's not just a semantics problem, but because it reflects these different core beliefs and background. Bring them together and we have this. We have confusion, misunderstanding, and then contention. Okay? 3, it's categorical, right? It means it delineates certain social, including cultural practices and concepts, right? So you say the key word, and right away you don't really think about culture and core belief, but it's there. The connection is very much there. And of course, the word is developed over time, sometimes generations. Okay. So these words are influential in society. So think about the word environment, right, in our society. Pretty influential word. It's got a very common meaning. I want to save the bears, etc. in Canada, versus I'm taking an environmental science class and we're studying organic chemistry. Okay? So the word the environment is there. It's a prominent word in our society, right? It's there in social debates. Okay? And the reason they're valuable is because they give this verbal identity, a social practice, belief, value systems, standards of judgment, right? So there's a lot that's going on in these key words. This isn't every word. This is some words in society that basically emerge from what people in society believe to be important. Okay? And then they're actively contested, right? They play an influential role in social debates or in national debate. Okay? Come election time in the United States, of course the Americans are everybody's laboratory for social debate, and then you can really see the key words emerge. Okay? So these are sort of very popular, important topics of society of the day. Okay? Again, technical, and it play in the population at large. Okay? So the national debate. When a country has a national debate about something, gay marriage, say. Okay? These words emerge. So this is where we are. This is where these keywords reside, in this notion of national debate. Okay? So, and finally, in terms of this criteria, they're part of a cluster of interconnected words. So here's a cluster, right? Clustering. So the different sectors have these ideas. Okay? So this becomes the vocabulary then for a certain topic or an issue, or in our case, this notion of a central dilemma. Okay? So that's all straight from the Keywords project, right? You know, but I'm going to not do the academic thing. I'm going to push it somewhere where I want to use it, and I'm going to change it, right? So here I'm going to move this into this war-affected context. I'm going to look at keywords that during Civil War have different meanings, okay? But I'm going to argue that before we get to war, you can see this. You can see this divergence in meaning. And so you should be able to spot these words and gain an increased or very nuanced understanding as to where we're headed and why. Okay? So the keywords that are most operable during war, right? I argue that you could see these or spot these prior to armed conflict. So let's look at a couple conflicts, right? So here we'll choose one, Darfur. Okay? So basically the keyword here is this one, Hakura. Okay? So Hakura means a very wide variety of things. The Janjaweed, for them, it's a call to arms. It's a cry of war. Okay? It can be, however, to farmers that document up there. Right? That is a Hakura granting Sultanate-era grant, land grant. Okay? So it's just a document. Right? To others, it can be a birthright, an ownership right. Okay? To some, it is not a Dar. Dar is a homeland, so Darfur is the homeland of the Fur tribe. So you've got a big tribal area, and it's a subset of those. It's actually a specific area, instead of a document, instead of a right. Okay? To others, it's a set of institutions or a set of rules. Right? And this set of rules can be part of your birthright, part of your cultural heritage that is immovable, or, depending on who you talk to, it's a set of rules and you can change it, toss it out the window, come up with a new set, etc. Okay? The document itself, once destroyed, according to some, means your rights to the land is gone. Okay? The others, no, the document is part of a broader narrative, and destroy it or not, it's always going to have a role. Okay? Islamic law has a big role. Right? If you read this, Islamic law is very much there. Okay? To others, it's like, no, Islamic law is basically like this. It's not the document, it's all land belongs to Allah and is open to any Muslim that can claim the land. Okay? So we have this idea of Hakur that is branched off from this sort of tree. So in today's conflict, it's got all these meanings. So you're the UN, you're playing lands, you get out, you're going to solve this conflict, and right? So there's a very confusing sort of idea around this very central issue. Okay? So how does this develop over time? So during the Sultanate era, this is before the colonial time in Darfur, the sultans granted these large dars or tribal homeland areas to certain groups. Okay? These were farmers. The folks north of them, the Arab nomads, didn't get a dar. They're nomads, right? They move around a lot, and so it was thought then that they only have transient rights. During the wet season, however, they would come down from the Sahara into the farming areas and were welcomed as guests. Okay? You can stay here for a while, even a couple of years, you're a guest, and then you go back north into the Sahara. Okay? Time moves on, these words develop. Now we're in the colonial period. The British, very much good at observing current institutions, taking the leadership, and then supporting the leadership, and in place sort of institutions so that they sort of rule from the back seat. Okay? So they come in and they solidify this Hakura system, which takes on a meaning in some ways to be a whole land tenure system, a set of institutions that's a system itself. Right? That's what the colonial period did. The nomad numbers grow during this time. They desire their own Hakura. They start to come down, and a couple of generations become farmers, become agro-pastoralists, stay as pastoralists, but still they're guests. Okay? The trick about Darfur is that land and power are connected. Right? You don't get power without land. Okay? This isn't really about being power hungry. It's do your kids get educated at all? Can you go into that market and shop at all? So it means discrimination, right? If you don't have land, you're clearly a guest, right? But as this guest notion moves through time, it actually means you're a second-class citizen. So the Arab nomads become second-class citizens in this area well to the south from where they're natively from. So this begins to agitate them, right, over the decades, during the colonial era. During the independence period then, the government initially supports this Hakura system, right, the documentation, etc., but then it withdraws it, right? And so then we have this issue where the government starts to come up with different laws, okay? Basically that if you haven't already registered your land with government, then it belongs to government, okay? Never mind that they never heard about the first law, that where you're supposed to register it, there's no way to register it, etc. So it became a real problem. The nomad population continues to grow. The Sahara continues to dry. It offers less and less of a livelihood option for the nomads, and so they start to stay south in these sort of Hakura and Dar areas. Okay? These corridors, they go back and forth between the Sahara and in Darfur, where the livestock movement usually happens, start to get closed. Okay? As the farmer population becomes more agitated with the growing nomad population and their desire to have land rights. They're starting to sort of shut them off. They're becoming threatened at this point. Okay? The nomads start to seek a way around Hakura. Right? Let's invoke Islamic law. Right? All land belongs to Allah and is open to any Muslim. Okay? The state actually does the first part of this as well, but instead of open to any Muslim, the next interpretation is, and the state is therefore the sort of caretaker of the land to allocate at will. Okay? And so they try to put pressure on Hakura law so that it becomes more inclusive. So you're not a second-class citizen as a nomad. Of course, if you're a Hakura practicing farmer, this is a threat. Okay? And so you actually firm up your ideas of what Hakura means as not an institution that can be changed, which is what the nomads want to do. No, it's set in stone. Okay? And you start to solidify about who's in and who's out. Because any land that the nomads would get has to come from someone's backyard. And they're unwilling to do that. Okay? During the war period, right? The rebels attack the government, the Janjaweed are recruited, right? Arab nomads are recruited as a group of Janjaweed. And basically the government says to the Janjaweed, we really need your help in moving against the rebels. And in compensation for this, you get to keep the land that you take, okay? This is great. So the nomads are thinking, oh, well, Hakkuri didn't work for us, Islamic law, bits and pieces, statutory law, kind of. So it's really going to move into this idea of we're going to move against the rebel units of what's going on in Darfur for the government, and then the government will give us the land. Okay? Unfortunately, though, the Janjaweed didn't have the same idea as government did in terms of battling the insurgents and getting the land. The government wanted the Janjaweed to actually move against the Sudan Liberation Army, right? The farmer-inspired rebels, right? Stand them down, defeat them, and then they could get some land. Janjaweed and the Arab, no, we're just going straight to the land, right? They just went straight to the villages, burned them, dislocated people, and took the land without engaging in the rebels. So, but the genie's out of the box now. They've been armed, they've been given money, right? And they kind of got their own momentum now. Now they're really going to operationalize their understanding of Hakkuri, which is destroy the document. It's an institution that can be changed, okay? The rebels on the farmer side, the Hakkuri practicing side, very much isn't about that. This is a birthright we're defending. So you can imagine the rhetoric and how volatile this gets over time. And of course, this aligns these different interpretations with the different sides in the war. Okay, so down here is one side of the war: the nomads, right, the Janjaweed, and the government, and they basically think these things of Hakkuri. Up here we have the rebels, the farmers, the Sudan Liberation Army, the Justice and Equality Movement, rebel groups. They have a very different idea of what Hakkuri is. Okay, fast forward to first Abuja and then Doha, where these groups are supposed to talk about this, and they're at loggerheads. Okay, and so the best that is hoped for is that I think there was a peace accord between the government and only one of the now many rebel units that are operating in Darfur. So that's Darfur. Let's look at Colombia. Here, our primary keyword is occupation, right? And other keywords in this cluster are abandoned, indigenous, and displacement, right? These are hotly contested words. What do they mean, right? To one side versus another, okay? So here we have a couple of different things on our evolutionary tree. What does occupation mean? It means you can go into basically an area that is indigenously occupied, the frontier is open, and as a large landholder, you can claim it and clear it and dispossess the indigenous population. You're occupying it. It's yours, right? Otherwise, it's an indigenously occupied land. You've occupied it since time immemorial. Your occupation is what counts. That's occupation, okay? So the government tries to resolve this. So passes a law and draws a boundary. These areas are indigenous. These areas are for settlers, right? Indigenous and settler areas, and so we have a boundary between them, okay? Occupation means one thing for indigenous. Occupation means a different thing for settlement. Over time, there's racial mixing, though. So it's hard to find truly indigenous people, right? So this becomes a problem because now if you're not really indigenous, then what are you doing in the indigenous area? Okay? And so the settlers can then move their own indigenous, now campesinos, mestizos, right, into these areas and claim it, right? So now it's difficult at this point to preserve a whole area as indigenous when it's full of partially or not indigenous people, okay? And so the area kind of devolves, right, from an indigenous-held, contiguous piece of land into just a multitude of small farms. That's occupation, okay? So basically, after this, we have an issue of, well, if I'm occupying an indigenously categorized area, therefore I'm indigenous, regardless of my ethnic background. So that was one notion of occupation, okay? Law 200 comes along and basically says, if you occupy it, you own it, okay? So this could be one thing to the indigenous people that it was intended for, and another thing to a large-scale settler, right, a commercial interest who also is going to use this, right? So now occupation takes a fairly twisted idea, okay? Again, I'm happy enough with the extreme inequity that goes on, and there's land invasions that happen in order to occupy the land. So let's track this through time, right? So back when the frontier was still open in Colombia, large farm settlement and indigenous dispossession happened. That meant occupation, right? Forward in time, this boundary era came on, right? Where the government drew a line in the rainforest, indigenous area, settlement area, and that's it. Okay? So occupation meant that. Moving forward, we have this racial mixing that goes on. You can imagine this is a generation or 2 or 3 where this racial mixing goes on. So now, indigenous and area, right, is different than a small campesino or peasant-held farm. The indigenous area breaks up into just very many small farms, and of course, favorite thing for the large-scale settlers to do is to get their own peasants and have them claim small farms, and then when there's enough of those all together, then the whole land is turned over to the large landowner, and all these small peasants that kind of belong to this landowner go somewhere else. Okay? So this idea of occupation is now very much played with over time. As you can imagine, if you're an indigenous person, right, or a small-scale farmer not attached to a large-scale landowner, this makes you fairly angry that this is happening, because there's this massive inequity in land holdings that goes on. Large-scale commercial farming is growing, and it's just taking over an enormous amount of land. So, fast forward to the mid-1900s, the peasants had enough, and they started just invading these large farms and occupying. Okay? And agrarian reform comes along and supports this invasions, right? So now a president comes along, and we're having agrarian reform. We're going to resolve this issue of huge inequity in land holdings, etc. And so there was resistance by the large-scale farmers. So the president says to the indigenous and the small-scale landholders, go occupy the large farms, and agrarian reform is behind it. And so they do. And so they have a huge movement that goes on, this occupation, right, of large-scale farms as the motor for legal agrarian reform. Okay, so depending on where you are here, right, you can like or not like that process that's going on. Right. So we've got time. So during the conflict period, FARC, right, the primary rebel group, links up with the peasant invasions, right, and moves forward against the sort of right-wing militias, and especially the large-scale landholders, right. So the FARC is so good, right, at helping the invasions that the large-scale landholders start to leave, okay, and the FARC takes over this area. They then secure it, and then they figure out, wow, we could actually sell this whole nice big farm to someone else at a lower price, a higher price. Enter the narcotraficantes here, and they're now part of the picture. Okay, so this idea of moving into a conflict period when we have all this profound disagreement about what occupation has meant through history is then a big part of the conflict. And so these different understandings have become aligned with different parts in the conflict. So here in purple I've got the alignment that pertains to the peasants, the indigenous people, and the FARC. Okay? And so basically land invasions, right? You're going to reclaim or occupy land that supposedly you lost. And by you, that means you personally, but your grandparents or your great-grandparents, right? That your lineage lost. You're going to occupy that. Okay? Here, Law 200 was really for you, the small-scale landholder, so its occupation, and here SF is small farmers, right? Its occupation is now supported by law, okay? On the other side in green here, we have these interpretations of land and occupation. So very, very different ideas about what's going on. Okay? Let's move on to Yemen, right? Here our keyword is sultanate land. And we've got state land, private land, and tenant land as our primary keyword. So sultanate land is a label of land, and we have history that moves through time that basically has it controlled by and called by and used by very, very different groups of people. Okay? So this is our last one. We'll move through this one quickly. We start off with a socialist period in South Yemen, a different country than North Yemen at the time, right? The state claims all the land, as was the experiment in many sort of socialist country, scared off the sultans and the sheiks, right, who normally ran these large sultanate areas. They flee to Afghanistan, some hook up with Osama bin Laden, and then return with some of his elements. Meanwhile, the land goes to tenant farming, okay? Some of the tenants think this is a pretty good idea. I can actually sell land that I'm renting to someone else, and they'll then own it as private land. So they do that, right? People start to come from northern Yemen to sort of buy land from tenant farmers. Can you do that? I'm renting a piece of land. If you're renting an apartment, can you actually sell it and make money? You can if you're here, right? And so this goes on. So this idea of sultanate land becoming sort of, what is it? Is it private? Is it lineage? Is it tenant? Right? It becomes very, very confused over time. South Yemen then unifies with the north, right, in 1990. President Saleh then calls the sultans and sheikhs back and gives them their land back. Okay? Not only does he give them their land back, but he puts this institution there. It's called the land sheikh. Okay? So one sultanate area is enormous. You can have maybe 5 sheikhs under one sultan. Okay? President Saleh says that now we're going to have a land sheikh, and I'm going to appoint them. And so the number of sheikhs grow into the thousands. And each one has a land allocation role now, whereas before they did not. Okay? So here, these sheikhs get to say what's going to happen with sultanate land. Of course, they're tied to President Saleh, who's from the north and governs from the north, so it gets very divisive and very, very complicated over time. And of course, this land is used as a form of patronage, right? You're my friend, you've done good things for me and your group, and I'm going to give you a bunch of land, okay? And so I'll give a bunch of land to this land sheikh who uses it for his own patronage system, and then it's tied up to the presidency. And so it becomes very, very difficult to move forward with this sort of idea in a peaceful way. The Arab Spring, 2011 comes along, right? The sultans and sheikhs now move very robustly to try to take land back from the tenants, but mostly from the northerners who bought it from the tenants. They've never gotten it back yet. They've tried the court system, not happening. Let's see, who's around that can help us out? Well, these guys are here, right? So now we're going to hook up with them militarily and start to move against these northerners and take the land back. So Al-Qaeda is only perfectly too happy to provide this service, right? Because then you gain adherence to this. And so it is connected with Al-Haraq, right? Which is a southern separatist movement, okay? So if you're, I don't know, the Americans, and you're trying to find some distinction between Al-Qaeda and Al-Haraq, it becomes murky, right? Because there's these issues going on in terms of what's going on in terms of sultanate land, okay? And again, this is also sort of aligned in the war here. It's a little more complicated. Here we have northern land interested in red, okay? And so they're interested in managing all the land in the south, keeping sort of privately held land that they've had, etc. In the purple, we have socialist southern era land claims, tenants selling to private. And then in the green, we've got the sultanate, indigenous, Al-Haraq / Al-Qaeda effort, right, to try to reclaim sultanate era land back to what it once was. Okay? So, to wrap up, we've got a couple patterns that have emerged out of all this, and the initial study I did had a handful of additional countries that looked at this issue of keywords and land rights. So, a couple of things. Keywords contribute to defining the sides in the war before the war happens, right? Keywords and the problems they embody are all involved law in some way, okay? Customary law, indigenous law, statutory law, Islamic law, etc. Keywords can be used as a tool in the war, okay? So, and the keywords and the countries can be sort of categorized. So let's really quickly look at a couple of these, right? 3 of the 4 are, I think, most interesting. So keywords help define who's fighting who in the war, okay? So the idea here is that the different meanings, who's at fault, who's victimized over generations, sort of is going to define who's opposed to who in the war. So further research questions for me, right, along this line is, can these keywords be spotted before the war? How far before the war? And can you look for this alignment of meanings, divisive uses of words? If you know what you're looking for, is that useful? And if you find them, are they useful in some way? In mediation, peace negotiation, land restitution, legal, the things of peace building, okay? Can you use these keywords in some way, the things that cause confusion, right, as a tool, right, in terms of both spotting before conflict and then doing something with it after the conflict, okay? So, law. For Darfur, we have customary law, Torah law, Islamic law, various interpretations, colonial independence. law, okay? Colombia, statutory law, settler areas and indigenous areas, customary peasant law, indigenous laws. Yemen, this mix of statutory and Islamic law, land shakes, the north is going to do patronage. So we have a confluence or opportunity, if you will, of law. So we know how this works to begin with, right? We have an agitator that seeks to be a politician. You see, oh, there's a couple of words here. I find justification for this in law, okay? Folks that were really good at this were the folks in the Balkans that engaged in ethnic cleansing, right? They would argue that this is legal. I have found the law, the part of the law that supports my efforts at ethnic cleansing, okay? So law is there as a part of a key word. So what I'd like to ask is, in terms of this law idea, is that given that use of law is there to push a narrative of grievance or to push an agenda toward conflict, can we also use law, right, or its interpretations to push it toward peace? So this is not enforcement, right? So if you're on the ground, if you're lucky enough to work with the UN in a post-war environment, and you say law, they're thinking about this. Pass a good law and enforce it. Okay? This is different, right? This is what's in the law, or what's in a new law, what can be encouraged in a law that will have people use it themselves in ambiguous or different ways, so we can essentially push a meaning purposefully in one direction or another. Okay? So we're going to try to spin it. Can we purposely spin a law, or the use of its law, in a peace-building way as opposed into a war-building way? Okay? And then there's categories of key words, right? So if you take these key words, they sort of fall out along two lines. One is action keywords, right? And one is label keywords. So transfer, occupation, displacement, exclusion, dislocation. These are sort of actions that take place, right? And then we have labels for land. Sultanate land, tenant land, Hakor, tribal land, homeland, private land, etc. Okay? So two sort of aspects of key words. So action keywords. So basically these are a series of repeated small events of dislocation and land takings. Okay? So imagine a process that basically has me taking your land and your land and your land. At the end of the day, I've got a big piece of land. So it's a repeated sort of series of events more at the individual household or individual farm level. Okay? So the problem is over how this takes place and that they take place. This operates differently, the label lands. This is, I have a huge chunk of land, I'm going to call it something new. Indigenous, sultanate, private. Okay? And so in my calling it something new, I take off a set of rights and I put down another set of rights. So these keywords seem to operate in one of these two separate ways. What's interesting is that a country usually is either all one or another. It usually only has action keywords or it's only got label keywords. Right? So Yemen is a label case. Sultanate land, or sultanate land, state land, private land, tenant land. Colombia, right? An action case. Occupation, abandonment, displacement. Darfur, label case. Hakor land, homeland, tribal land. Here's a couple of others I looked at. Liberia, a label case. State-sanctioned customary law, clan land, property, adequate area. Israeli-Palestinian example, settlement, transfer, absenteeism, that's an action case. Sierra Leone, cell, very different understandings about what cell, transfer, exclusion are, right? So we have these very sort of different ways of looking at this problem of keywords. And so I'm asking, in this regard, right, a future question is, given this label and this action kind of difference, right, between these two cases, what might this mean for a peace process, right? So these are all pretty large-scale, multi-million-dollar efforts after a war. Land policy reform, restitution of land, disarmament, reintegration, etc. So can we use this understanding of key words in land rights to engage these processes in peace building? Is there something there? Right? Subsequent research question. So, conclusion. Is there some utility in peace building? Okay? So we know very, very well that an agitator, an instigator, a politician, a warlord can agitate a population, right, to vote for them or to move against those people or to be angry or angrier about this or that. And then keywords especially buttressed by law, and the part of your culture and your history of grievance are really, really important. Okay? This can get us a step toward war. So one question is, can we actually use that and push it back toward peace? Okay? One of the problems here is that if you work with the international community in war torn scenarios, they don't like the stuff that's ambiguous. They want a project, a measurable, empirical project on the ground. Okay? And so you start it here, and you stop it here, and you measure the peace that's been gained. Okay? So this is different, right? This is seeking to push keywords in a society purposefully in a certain direction, right? Toward a peace-building idea. So this is ambiguous. This is kind of messy. This is working for the whole population. This isn't, look, you people that can't go home, right? You people turn in your weapons. So it's not that part of, that's sort of a discrete, precise idea. So it's much more ambiguous. And I would argue that the international peace-building community needs to consider these other tools that are out there kind of in the woodwork and looking at these keyword dilemmas that are sort of the focal points that narratives of grievance coalesce around, and ask, how can we move segments of a civilian population, a discrete population, purposefully in one direction, given that they can be purposely moved in another direction by a politician or woman. So I'll wrap it up there, right? A little longer. I thought I'd talk, but for me it's very exciting, this sort of human geography stuff. So I can take questions if you like, and then we'll go from there. Huh?
So I'm wondering if it's a little bit of a time factor here, or a time mismatch, in that war is seen as a crisis that needs to be resolved quickly, and you said they need to have really discrete outcomes. And yet what you were saying is that these keywords develop over time, and you trace it actually quite far back in time. Do you think, given more time, there might be an ability to use these keywords more effectively, or do you think that probably just because the international peace-building community doesn't quite, it doesn't mesh with what they're trying to do? But is it a factor of time, partially?
Good question. I think that if you know what you're looking for, sometimes you can move it ahead quick. And I remember hearing in Darfur, right, from some of these folks that were behind the agitation. So part of my job in Darfur was to go talk to the leadership of these various groups and say, what's your take on land rights? Do you agree? Is it technical? Is it not? What they wanted to talk about was the fact that President Bashir was been indicted by the ICC, and so that had an effect on them. So now they are considering that as secondary occupants on Hakura land, there might be some doubt. This is ambiguous. Actually, I'm not going to have this land. The institutions aren't changed. I haven't taken it over. It's actually back the way it was. So that's a kind of an accident, right? That effect was there. The UN certainly wasn't organized up to plan that the indictment of the president would have this sort of shadow effect down to the individual Janjaweed fighters. Who knew they themselves weren't going to be indicted, but they were seeing that the winds are blowing differently, right? And so they started to hedge their bets now. And the secondary occupants, the Arab pastoralists, were starting to think, I got to get out of this in some way. And so you heard these stories about a 10-year-old son as a secondary occupant, go to the market, find the 10-year-old son of a farmer who used to live here, give him this money. So they're starting to sort of interact now, right? So you start to see those games being played. So that sort of idea of kind of very, it's not grassroots, but very kind of ad hoc effect can happen if the tweaking, the spinning, is done in certain ways, right? So if I would argue that if you know what you're looking for, okay, usually you don't stumble across it, like this idea of the local Janjaweed and secondary occupant leaders being very concerned that there was this indictment and that the world was moving against them now they had to think differently. So if you know what you're looking for, my question is, can you actually tweak it in certain ways and push it forward, right? I'm not sure we would always have to have the same amount of time necessary to solve a problem that it took to start it. Hopefully.
Two questions. I'm going to muddy the waters a bit. First one is about, well, right now President Obama is asking Congress to go to war against ISIS or ISIL, depending on who you ask, and that alone is kind of a naming question. But the people there are talking about the caliphate. And it just seems to me that that's a very powerful historic word in reference to land reform, democracy. It just seems very foolish for the United States to give up use of that word to what the United States considers terrorists. That's one question, one point. The other thing is, and I'll switch geographical location to geography here. The Economist has made a big deal about De Soto in Peru and how his book and his way of pivoting the use of the word capitalism in Peru really led to the demise of the Shining Path. And I was wondering how this sort of fits in with your theories here.
Yeah, the first one, in terms of the caliphate, haven't really sort of applied it to that, but I could see where that, as a word and its historical meaning, right, from the inside of the ISIL fighter or planner or leader, would be something very different than if I were to say it, certainly something very different if Obama and the military planners are going to be, right? And so it's an interesting, very territorial issue, right? Land rights, including territorial rights, a very big part of that. We're very wedded to the nation state, right? The ISIL fighters clearly less so. They want something very, very different. And the governing of that to be very, very different. Separation of church and state, the last thing you want for those guys. So I think that might be a very interesting take on it. Is that a civil war becoming that, you could argue, right? Sunni, Shia. And so I think that perhaps there's some mileage there. I used to work with the folks in the sort of naval college, right? And those generals and colonels are the very first ones to say, you cannot kill yourself out of a war, okay? Which is what boots on the ground and drone strikes and sort of the airstrikes are attempting to do. If we just do enough, right, then the caliphate will go away. The thinking, the history essentially will go away. So if you look at certain specific civil wars, one favorite thing with the UN that they like to do is to take that top bad guy out, right? You can either take him out literally, or the UN like to say, we want you to become a politician, okay? So you take Warlord X in Afghanistan, and you say, now you remember Parliament, and hoping that is going to solve itself. Turns out that a bad guy has 20 beneath them, but one really takes his place. So can you kill your way out of a conflict, right? So the idea of a caliphate and a very, that resonates on the ground versus attacking it from the air with boots on the ground, a bit of a disconnect there, right? These are pretty big power plays that are going on. So good comment. The second one, De Soto, right? I met a guy who ran De Soto's project in Guatemala. Because as you know, De Soto's idea is basically you have all these people out there, they already have shacks, but they're not secure in their holdings, so the idea is to give them title. Now they're secure in their holdings, and they can go out and get a job, they can take the title, get a mortgage or collateral on it, etc. But the guy who did that in Guatemala, and his idea was 80% of the people involved in that lost land. Okay? So it's actually good for some people. It's not good for, in my view, an intact, indigenous, or customary land rights system. It is good, perhaps, in a city where you've got a lot of dislocated people or settlers that have crowded into slums and shanty towns. And so their own sort of land rights system is either back where they left it or it's completely dismantled. Okay? So there in that shanty town, a land mafia runs the game. Right? So some of the problem with some of the donors, like USA, they see this magic bullet, right? Sounds very good when you hear De Soto speak, and maybe it's worked in kind of some of the slums of Lima and Cairo and Nairobi. But some of the donors want to take that bullet into the rural areas and for them upgrade these rural areas. In other words, convert sort of lineage-held land to private land so you can buy it and sell it and create a land market, and then we're all sort of commodity sort of sense with regard to land. That actually has been tried. That'll just hand out titles, try to convince or educate people enough to respect a title and disconnect from a customary system. What's lost there, in my view, is that in a customary or a lineage system, you get more than just rights to land. You get personal security, you get food security, all sorts of securities are connected to you belonging to a piece of land. With land as a commodity, you don't have that, right? So none of us have personal security, I call the police, connected to whether you own land or not, right? So you can find a burglar in your house, you call the police up, send the police officer does not say, are you the owner of your property? Because if not, I'm not coming, right? That's lost. So the problem is you don't have developing countries that can put together a social safety net, security, food security, welfare for its whole population so that land can then become unconnected from its other functions in those societies and just become a commodity like a candy bar that you can buy yourself. So there's a couple of issues I have with this. I think it works in some places where things have already fallen apart, so to speak. Back there.
Do you see your theory as more preventative or like reactionary to efforts?
Yeah, good point. I guess my question is can it be both? Okay. Can we spot these keywords before we get to conflict, right? So we can all pick a country or 5 or 20 on the globe that we know isn't in war, but wow, there's segments of the populations that are very aggravated, right? If we could get in there and say, what are the keywords, right? Do we know what to look for in terms of finding food? Is there utility there? After a conflict, right, I think that ideas of restitution, right, going home, et cetera, would need to be nuanced by this idea of a key word. We also need to get our peace negotiators sort of much more able to figure out what's going on. What are the central issues here? But what's interesting to do if you ever have the chance to actually go to peace negotiations, you've got the third party there, the UN, you've got the two belligerent parties, and they're talking to each other, and the UN thinks one thing's going on, and these two folks know something else is going on. They're talking about where the diamonds are, this guy talking about how we get the refugees home, and we're all using the same words, and it's chaos, right? And so is there some utility there in coming to a little better grip, right, for the international community in terms of the nuances of what's going on? In a research question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you spoke a lot about keywords and how they're used to strengthen national and also the us versus them paradigm. You also spoke about possession of land and ownership and the sovereignty that people who own the land have over that land. Like in the cases that you researched, did you notice any states actually using physical barriers to keep out the crowd?
Physical barriers. You do find the next best thing, which is a line of guys with guns, right? So that's a pretty effective barrier, right? And so you have that sort of over and over. Of course, those lines move back and forth. It's the next line of guys with guns, etc. You have sort of forms of claim that are historical. That river or that mountain range divided your land versus our land. And so you can try to sort of reenact those or build a fence along those, etc. A lot of times that they're in history, boundaries weren't aligned, like we're used to having them be between countries or counties or something. They're zoned. So if you're going to move from a zone to a line, you're always going to get disagreements about where it should be. Right? So that can be a fairly large issue. But no, you don't find a lot of sort of, let's construct it here or there, right? I know you're thinking the Israelis have a different idea, right? But there again, where does that wall go? If it had gone a different place, right, versus where it is, would there be more or less problems today? So building a wall is sort of like trying to draw a very nice boundary to separate warring parties. You can try to do that. Maybe that gets you peace today, but you've got to engage a lot of what else is going on and really, in my view, make the peace stick. Right? Make it durable all the time. Yep.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but teaching my course on sustainable development and climate change, it occurs to me that climate change is a keyword.
Indeed.
Maybe we're at a moment in time pre-conflict, and if we scale this up to a global perspective rather than a particular landscape scale, such as what you're talking about, it's just something to think about moving forward. I wonder if you might have any comments.
Yeah, I guess I would call it editorial. I read one of the Canadian papers that basically had this phrase, climate change jihadists. Okay? So from this point of view, scary as it might be, these are people that believe in climate change so much that they're gonna, what, jihad, right? So you know, is it a keyword? I would definitely agree. But it's interesting to watch the progression of the word, right? It used to be very technical. Now it's kind of everybody. Global warming also means climate change. It's political. It was really interesting to see jihad connected to it. So that's the keyword changing, right? And becoming mighty more cute in some way. So I would definitely agree that it's definitely a keyword in society.
You talked a lot about like keywords and how the two like whole different parties will have keywords that they understood differently. With like globalization being so huge, do you think that words that like third parties impose on what's happening between local areas, like say the UN or like, you know, the West or the US imposes like words they use to describe conflicts that are abroad, do you think those are different keywords or do they still count as keywords?
Yeah, it's a really good comment because it's kind of aligned with one take that the international community has in terms of land rights and conflict. So because land rights and conflict are very much, you know, included in identity and history and victimization and revenge and all these really emotive hot topics, the idea is to move land rights into a purely technical jargon, right? And so if we say, we're going to talk about land rights in a technical way only, right? Not about who belongs and whose grandmother shouldn't have done this or that or came across the border with. No, it's a technical exercise. Well, you can do that. Land rights lends itself very technically to cadastres and, you know, demarcations and surveying and inheritance, all kinds of things, right? Get as technical as you want. So it does try to do this, right? It takes these words, but even a whole approach. So if we can just make this really hot emotional issue technical, we're going to discuss it more coldly, then do we get success there? The international community thinks that yes, that's a way to go. So it does bring these words in from the outside. I think your point maybe gets at, should it try harder to purposefully take a word completely unknown to the local conflict and say, we have this word, it's going to mean this. Because then it gets the chance to define it exclusively to what it's going to mean. As opposed to try to, what it's doing now, resolve the differences between different words. So in Darfur, you saw some funny things where the UN came out with this sheet. This is what Hakur is going to mean. Nomad, Janjaweed, Far. So you're going to tell them what it means. Well, you know, they just want it out. And so it gets no traction. But your notion is very good. If you could bring in an outside word unknown to the local kind of discussion, could you get some traction? Anything else? Great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.